Coming up next on Another View, Unsung Heroes of the African American Experience. It's a history lesson about those who dedicated their lives to making this country a better place at the cost of tremendous personal sacrifice. And they did it, not for fame or fortune, but because it was the right thing to do. Our favorite historian, Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander of Norfolk State University, joins us to share the stories of pioneers like Vivian Carter Mason, Ella Baker, Barbara Johns, and Evelyn Butts, Hampton Roads women who made a difference. We celebrate African American History Month right after this news from NPR.
Discussing the issues and celebrating the successes of the African American community. This is Another View.
And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Before we get started today on our discussion about African American History Month, I just want to take a moment to pay tribute and to say to the Decker family that our thoughts and prayers are with you today on the death of attorney, judge, and a personal friend of mine, Peter Decker Jr. Uncle Pete, as a lot of people called him, was a philanthropist and a wonderful person who just reached out and was always about helping his fellow man. And so, every time I would see him, he would say, "Who loves you, darling?" And you know what, Pete? We love you. And we wish your family the best during this hard time. So just wanted to take a moment to say that. Now, February is African American History Month. It's a time when special emphasis is given to the contributions of African Americans to the American fabric. Here on Another View, we believe that the history of African Americans has daily relevance, which is why we talk about our history all throughout the year. A few months ago, historian Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander joined us with fascinating history of African Americans here in Hampton Roads who made significant contributions to the civil rights movement. And we're happy to have you back, Dr. Newby-Alexander. Welcome back to Another View. We're going to talk about some more things. We did have some people call him a pop icon. Some people call him a revolutionary in terms of changing the culture and the color of media. Don Cornelius this week. From a historian's perspective, how do you think he will be remembered as other generations look at him?
Well, when you think about pop culture, often people define pop culture by American Bandstand. Mm-hmm. But when Soul Train debuted, it introduced to the world, really, the kind of music that had influenced the music that was being performed on American Bandstand. And it actually changed the performers who were coming on American Bandstand. It diversified them. It forced them to begin to compete with Soul Train. But unlike Bandstand, Soul Train really was about celebrating and bringing attention to the different music forms that were emerging in American society in the 1960s and 70s. Mm-hmm. And so Don Cornelius was a person who tried to pay respect to that. It wasn't the kind of show that was buffoonish in any way. It showed a lot of the new dance steps that mm-hmm. young people were mimicking. The
Soul Train line.
Yes, the Soul Train line, which is of course still
yes. It's iconic.
It's iconic, and it is a dance form that you see a lot of cultures have, mm-hmm. and it made it acceptable. It mainstreamed it, mm-hmm. and so he will be a person who will be sorely missed.
Absolutely. And when you think about the fact that in the 70s when there were a lot of things exploding and happening in the 70s, but he brought out artists that the Black community was very comfortable with and familiar with, the James Browns and Temptations and so forth, but he was able to expose them to a much greater audience.
Yes, and what he did on Soul Train really impacted the way that popular culture would remember many of these iconic singers and performers.
It's a tragedy that he took his own life. Do you think that will play a lot in as the history is written?
Not really, because we're not talking about a person who took their own life in the middle of their career or because of depression necessarily, although that's kind of a theme that you see for a lot of great people. But for those who understand, if you're facing a catastrophic illness, as I understand he was, you can understand if you've been in a family whose a family member has passed away from cancer or some other illness, you understand how people facing that try to spare their family members and try to spare themselves. The heartbreak and the torment of going through that. And so I think that would just be sort of the end note of a longer and more important discussion about the impact that he had on American popular culture.
Okay, well, February is now National African American History Month. When did the title change? Do you know?
No, it's actually news to me, but I know that the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALH, which is the organization that Carter G. Woodson and others helped to form back in 1915, when it was the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, and they started it at Howard University, that they're the ones who came up with Negro History Week to begin with. And what they've done every so many decades is try to continue to make this relevant. And you know, when it initially started, it was designed to ensure that African American children in the nation were provided, that their teachers and their parents were provided with information about African American history that was being left out of all of the history books that young people were learning about in the schools, or that they were being used to teach them in the schools. And of course we know that a lot of these books would even talk about how slavery was a good thing, and how
happy the slaves
were so happy.
Forth.
And so this was to, you know, as these, they provided teaching materials that would help teachers to provide to their students in evidence that this history that they read in the textbooks was not accurate, that here you have historians who are producing a whole different genre of materials, and they have researched this material, and so this is trustworthy material. And so ASALH was very important in providing that. Now, once we got into the period of integration, and especially when schools were desegregated.
Let me stop you for 1 second and make something very clear. ASALH started when schools were still segregated.
Right, 1915.
Exactly. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And so by the time you get into the 1960s and 70s, especially in the South, but even in the North, as people were starting to move out of their segregated communities because the laws were being challenged, and they moved into, and the practices, by the way, were being challenged, and so you started to see much more integration in the schools. That's when Black history was not being taught because the Black teachers were not in a lot of these schools. And so the ASALH was pushing to make this more of a national issue and a national dialogue, and that's when they changed it from Negro History Week to Black History Month. And so it's not surprising then that they would go this next step, and because it's not a national issue where Black people have a dialogue, but it should be a dialogue that we have nationally and internationally, because the way that history has been written, not always by historians, but by people interpreting it for, say, public history. You think about the plantations that are out there, and how many plantations don't want to really talk about slaves. They talk about the
economic
servants.
and the servants and the economy, and
they spend most of their time getting the visitor to be engaged with the lives of the plantation owners, not those who were enslaved on that plantation. So you don't have any any feelings for those who had been enslaved, but you have all these feelings for those who were the owners of those who were enslaved. And so changing the way that people view things has been a challenge. And so I'm not surprised that Asala has pushed, because they've been very much advocating in Congress and with the White House to begin to, really reinvent how Black History Month was viewed, and to see it not from, okay, we're looking at February. Because, and a lot of people have a lot of myths even about February. I mean, February was chosen, and it actually was the second week in February that was chosen by the framers of Asala to recognize and honor two men who had been important in African American freedom, and that was Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, whose birthdays
were both
the second week of February. And so when they expanded it to February, to the entire month, a lot of people said, well, that's the shortest month, but that's not why. It was because February was an important month.
Thank you for clarifying that, because you do hear a lot of people say, gee whiz, we get a month and they give us the shortest month of the year. But that's not the case. That's not the reason.
Well, and also this whole idea of they. Who are they? Right. Well, they are African Americans who wanted to make sure that there's a national dialogue about the history of African Americans and not just the contributions of African Americans, because that can be almost an aside, but the involvement of African Americans in the history and the making of our nation. Even the decisions, even if you have no political power, your presence impacts decisions that people make. And that issue, that point, is often left out. That motivator is often left out when this kind of history is translated to the general public and in the classroom. And that's why even the textbooks that are written today, states have such a politicized mandate as to what they want in the textbooks. And so they have to go and get writers to do it as opposed to historians, because historians are going to tell a very different story that's not political.
440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call. Join our conversation. We're talking about African American History Month, and the president just recently did the proclamation for the month of February, and the theme this month is Black women in American culture and history, which always makes me excited. But my question to you is, there's a difference in the way that Black women participated in the changing of our culture in terms of bringing the races together and so forth from men, from the Black men who were involved. Do you think?
Yes, very much so. And women in general have approached society, I would say, in a different way, in part because of the roles that society, which is led by men, have allowed women, and women have always been pushing against that in different ways. And so often in the past historians, who were mostly men, were only writing from their vantage point. And over the past 40 years, there have been increasingly more women who have entered into the field of history, who have said, well, wait a minute, you're leaving out 50% of the population, and there are some things that have occurred that resulted from the efforts of women, not men. One of the biggest movements that brought women clearly into the forefront of politics was the progressive movement. And I find it interesting that some of the more recent conservative politicians have been talking about pulling that veil back before the progressive era, which started in the 1890s. This is the period that brought about the 19th Amendment, allowing women the right to vote. This is a period that put labor laws into practice, child labor laws, minimum wages, maximum working hours, that put into place protections for society, so sanitation, provision for health care and so forth. All of that came about as a result of the progressive era. what existed before was, in my mind, when you think of the urban areas, you think of a lot of anarchy. Saloons were rampant, and a saloon it operated in two ways. It was a bar and it was a house of prostitution. And a lot of the women in Norfolk, black and white, organized societies that would go out and meet the trains every day to see what young women were getting off these trains, because some of these women who were coming to the cities for work would meet some of these men who were meeting the train, claiming that they were there to meet them to
take them
give
to
them
a job,
and they would actually take them to these houses of prostitution. And so women decided that's got to stop. We have got to protect our society. We have to protect our community. We have to protect our children, because this is negatively impacting our family structure. And so women, many of whom were educated, but some who were not, but became educated, got involved in these kinds of organizations. And so it's out of that movement that you would see a whole different cadre of women who would become the leaders in a lot of organizations, including civil rights organizations and women's rights organizations. And they were the ones who were championing birth control. And birth control is not the same as abortion. A lot of people confuse the two. But they were championing putting more money into medical research when it comes to problems that are problems that women are involved in only, and they were putting much more money into trying to protect society, because they weren't interested as much in making money as they were in protecting the children and protecting their communities.
So, and also, weren't these women more interested in collaboration across the racial lines as opposed to just doing this for the black community, or not?
Well, it depends on
who it is.
There were some white women who were interested in reaching across racial lines. Most of them, though, followed, especially in that time period, they followed the racial limitations, where they wanted strictly a segregated situation. The black women, however, pushed that envelope. There's this iconic picture, for example, of the women's suffragists marching in Washington, D.C. Well, the organizers, the white women who were organizing that event, did not want the black women to participate at all. And the black women pushed to the front of the line and began marching. So they inserted themselves into that iconic picture, and of course that movement, even though the white women didn't want them to be a part of that. You would see black women, and I'm thinking especially of Vivian Carter Mason in this area, because this kind of thing had been going on in a lot of northern areas where black women were seeing, well, the way to change things is to get the white women of these leaders, the wives of these white leaders, seeing what they're seeing, and get their wives then to start pestering them to change what needed to be changed. And so in the 1930s and even 40s, you had black women who were getting white women to come with them to Huntersville and to see the unpaved streets and the open sewers and the homes that had no electricity, no running water, to go to the schools that were operating on half time. So they were so overcrowded that they would go from 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. for one group of students, and then from 12 p.m. to 3 p.m. or 4 p.m. for another group of students. So black teachers who were being paid half of what white teachers were being paid had to teach
twice
2
as
to
hard.
3 times to 4 times more students.
Wow. Well, since you brought up Vivian Carter Mason, let's talk about her story. Tell us who she was and what was she known for.
Well, you know, she's sort of a really interesting person because she's not originally from Norfolk. She was originally from Pennsylvania. Her family moved up to New York, and it was while she was at Columbia University that she met a man who she would later marry. His name was William T. Mason Sr., and he was originally from the West Indies. And he worked for the Durham, North Carolina insurance company.
Oh, okay.
And he was actually assigned to come to Norfolk to be an insurance agent. And this was about in 1923. It was in 25 that they got married. And so she moved down to Norfolk. And she had been working with the YWCAs. She had been trained as a social worker. And when she came to Norfolk, there were no real jobs. You had the Phyllis Wheatley YWCA here, but it was very small, very limited, not much that she could do. And she was a very educated and motivated individual, so she started writing columns in the newspaper. She wrote a regular column in the Journal and Guide, and then later she would write columns in other black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and so forth. And an opportunity came about in New York that she could actually get a job in the welfare department. And her husband went up there, bought a brownstone, set her up there. Their son had already been born, and they really didn't want their son to be educated in a segregated
because
institution.
When she grew up in New York, Pennsylvania or New York, she also lived in a predominantly white neighborhood, did she not?
Well, it was a mix. It was a mix. It was a mix, but it was mostly white. Yeah, because
which
New
must
York,
have been very different from coming here to Norfolk.
Very much so. But you had some neighborhoods in New York that were all black. I mean, I'm thinking of in the Harlem section, because blacks could not purchase property on Manhattan Island. And so Harlem was the area where they could begin to purchase property, and that was predominantly a Jewish area at the time. But it's interesting because it's in the 20s that so many blacks from Norfolk and Portsmouth were moving up to that area to get better jobs and to have better opportunities, that they actually created organizations that were the Sons of Norfolk. And so you had to actually be born in Norfolk to join that particular organization. You can imagine that didn't last that long. But their children continued to be members of that organization. But they were there. They organized themselves to help others coming up to settle in and to really have a social network.
So Vivian Carter Mason and her husband have a commuter marriage, basically.
Yes.
Which was very progressive back then. And she takes the son to New York to raise him in private schools and so forth, and they pick up the story from there.
Yeah, they would come back in the summer. Well, the son would come back and he would stay. They would be visiting constantly by train. In fact, she was seriously injured in a train accident in the 1940s, which would happen periodically, that you would have these horrific train accidents, and that would continue to plague her for the rest of her life. But she ended up becoming one of the top managers in the Welfare Bureau in New York. She supervised over 4,000 people. And while she was in New York, she became a member of some important organizations, and she was eventually voted to be on the executive committee of the National Council of Negro Women. And that organization was started and headed for a number of years by Mary McLeod Bethune, who was not only a disciple of Booker T. Washington, but she was also very progressive in her ideas about the role that women could play, a very politicized and a very visible role in changing society and in having an impact on even the international level. And
she brought up on the international level about how blacks were being treated in the United States, even while the United States was going around trying to get the world to become a democracy.
Yes. In fact, it's interesting because Bethune was the first president of the National Council. The second president was Dorothy Farraby from Norfolk. And then Vivian Carter Mason became the third president of the National Council. And so Norfolk has had a significant visible international role. And so Vivian Carter Mason was very much a part of the world stage. When you look at her life and you look at the things that she was involved in, she was very much, I would say, a disciple of internationalism, of seeing commonalities among women internationally. And she traveled through the Middle East. She did several tours of Europe, and we're talking about right after the Second World War. And she became, eventually, when she retired from a lot of those activities and she moved back to Norfolk permanently, she became the first African American woman to be appointed to the school board in Norfolk. Even prior to that, in the 1940s, she's the one who helped to form the Women's Interracial Council. And she was using what she had seen, the models she had seen in other cities, and applied it to Norfolk. Mm-hmm. And it began to make a difference. Even though a lot of the laws were not changed at that point, what it did was it opened a dialogue between women across racial lines in a way that had not been before. Mm-hmm. And you see these kinds of women who came up during that time period, who saw the need to open a dialogue. It's something that I think we've lost in this current time period. People yell at each other, they talk at each other, but they don't have a conversation. Mm-hmm. And so they knew that a conversation had to be initiated before you could begin to reach out your hand and reach across these really artificial divides, mm-hmm. and to see how we are common. And that's really the issue that I would say a lot of these women who became leaders had. This idea that we have more commonalities, and if we can look beyond these artificial dissimilarities, mm-hmm. and see our commonalities, we can work together and make a difference.
Wow. If you're just joining us, we're talking with Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander from Norfolk State University. She's a historian, and we're talking about National African American History Month and the theme of Black women in American culture and history. And we're talking about women who had a particular influence in the Hampton Roads area, or who were from the Hampton Roads area and had an influence in the national and international stage. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 if you have any questions about the women that we're discussing. The next one I want to talk about was a very young woman when she made a huge difference. Her name is Barbara Johns, and before we talk about her, she was from Farmville, Virginia. Lisa Godley has a preview.
Thousands of school children who visit the state capitol each year will now see 16-year-old Barbara Johns and her classmates. On April 23rd of 1951, Johns led a walkout and demonstration at Robert Russa Moton High School in Farmville, Virginia, to protest the intolerable conditions at the school. 450 students followed Johns out of those doors. LaVon Fryer was one of them.
We sit in tar paper shacks, and I can remember sitting there with an umbrella in my left hand, trying to write with my right hand, because when it rained, it leaked in the place.
Fryer says the tar paper shacks were cold and the bathrooms were outside. It would take another 3 years before the Supreme Court would strike down separate but equal. But this was only the beginning of the long struggle against massive resistance.
And Barbara Johns was 16.
She was an extraordinary person. She really was a disciple of her uncle, Vernon Johns, who was a nationally known civil rights advocate. But, when we think about 16, we think that's so young. And it is in some ways. Yeah. But, I was a little radical, militant firebrand
so was I,
at 12, much less at 16.
That's very true.
It's what she did was extraordinary at any age, but what it took was courage. And there's a tendency to think that the person with the big mouth is the one with courage. It's not. It's what you do. And she was known as a very quiet person. And she was very thoughtful. She listened, she read a lot. She was very concerned about what was going on. She could see the world beyond the four corners or the small little circle that she lived in. And her parents and her uncle helped her to see beyond that. And he was the one who actually had her reading a lot. And so she was on the road to really being an intellectual. And this is what propelled her to decide she's going to make a difference. And she had a small group of people. She was a planner as well, because they had this thing all planned. They had, in fact, I had an opportunity. I was asked by Tim Reed to write a portion of the script where they did a documentary on her, and I had to recreate based on the hundreds of pieces of evidence and information that was there, including some discussions from her and others about what she said, and I had to kind of recreate what she might have actually said at that moment and what she did.
Because nobody actually recorded
Nobody
what she
recorded
said.
it. And I had a chance to talk with her sister, who's still alive, and she said to me, that's what I remembered that she said. And so it made me feel good that I was in part channeling her to some degree.
Yes.
But she got a handful of friends together, and they passed the word along because they didn't want the school officials to get in trouble. And so they had everything set up where there would be they would orchestrate that all the students would go to the assembly hall. Wow. And they were trying to figure out why were they there. And then she got up and asked everyone, all the teachers and the principal, whatever, to leave. And
just left the students there.
And very respectfully, leave, please. And they left after some insistence. They left. And she got up there on the podium and told them what they needed to do and why they needed to do it, and then follow me.
Wow.
And they all got up and followed her out, and they had the walkout at that point. And of course, the fury came down on her family. They burned crosses, threats, and so forth, and her family forced her to leave the area because they were afraid that they would kill her. And when you go to Prince Edward County even today, to Farmville, you see the vestiges of segregation are still very much in existence. You see the black section and the white section. But telling that story, I think, was an important starting point, because people have to see what really existed for them to see what exists now, for them to even have that perspective.
Her case became a part of Brown versus Board of Education.
Yes. Yeah. And it's the only case that was really the result of young people taking possession of their education.
Cassandra, when you think about this now, not only did she orchestrate the walkout, but then took it to the next level in terms of legal action. Yes. I mean, of convincing the NAACP attorneys, can you take this on? Can we do something with this?
Yes. And of course, again, we're talking about a young person who wasn't just coming at it out of nowhere. This is a young girl who had been talking with her uncle, who had been talking with people about this, who had been confiding with one of her teachers. And so she had gathered a lot of information around her, and she had planned a lot of this.
Wow. So what happened to her after she left the area for her own safety? And then after everything else happened, what happened to her?
I think it would, like a lot like Mildred Loving, she led a very private life. It's as if it's almost as if she kind of dropped off the planet until people started by the 1970s going back and saying, "Tell us your story." And then she was out there telling her story. She passed away, I believe it was in 1991. But it took quite a while for people to be even aware of her story, for her to tell it. She did not really participate in any major way in the civil rights movement, although in her own private way she did. But as a young person, that was her most important, and of course one of the most important contributions.
And it's interesting because I had never heard of Barbara Johns until we started working on the Norfolk 17 documentary that Lisa Godley produced, and that's when I first became familiar with her. I don't remember reading about her or hearing about that part of Brown versus Board of Education, how it all got started. So once again, it points to understanding the entire picture.
Well, what's interesting is a lot of people who seem to have a sustained involvement in the civil rights movement typically were already college students, and they continue from that point on. You think about John Lewis and others at Fisk, right. And James Bevel and Diane Nash and others. But when they were younger, like that, high school, typically, if they took a leadership role, it seems as if the families were more concerned about their safety and tried to hide them from a lot of that. You think about even some of the young people who were involved with desegregating a lot of the schools. Most of them really did not stay involved with the civil rights movement because those actions were so they so psychologically impacted them that it's almost as if for a long time they wanted to be in a private life as opposed to
being out in the public. Yeah.
And it was usually later in their life that they would begin to really tell their story and be more active in that realm.
Wow. Okay, let's talk about Ella Josephine Baker. Who was she?
It's so interesting that her name was Ella Josephine Baker.
I know.
But she
thought
was
so too.
she was born before Josephine Baker really became known. But Ella Jo Baker was born here in Norfolk. Her family was originally from Littleton, North Carolina, the same place that P.B. Young and his family were from, and a lot of blacks, actually, including my family.
Young, the owner of the New Journal Guide.
Right. Mm-hmm. A lot of people came from Eastern North Carolina and came to this area looking for jobs and other types of employment, as well as more educational opportunities. And but her family had come to Norfolk, and then when she was still a child, she moved. The family moved back to Littleton. But what's interesting is in her autobiography, she tells a story of being here in Norfolk and having encountering a little white boy who called her the N-word, and she talked about how she basically clocked him. And I think that's indicative of the kind of person that she was. She didn't fight. She didn't yell at him. She didn't scream at him. She clocked him and walked away. and that seemed to be the type of person she was. She was seen as a quiet person who, when she took action, it was quick, severe, and then she let it go. Interestingly, she got involved with the NAACP by the 1940s. Actually, I think it was 1940 when she was hired as a secretary, and she was very involved, going to meetings. But the NAACP was very traditional. It was very conservative. A lot of people think of the NAACP as radical, but it was a very conservative organization. It wasn't until the 1920s that they even had a black director and president of the NAACP.
Really?
Right. The first the first officers were all white. And so the NAACP was also very conservative with regards to the role of women in leadership positions. And she was told quite frequently that even though she was more capable of some of these other leaders, that she was a woman. And therefore, black men are supposed to take the leadership role, not the women.
That probably didn't set well with her, sounds like.
No, it didn't. But she persevered, but it was Ella Jo Baker and a few others, but it was really her that had the idea to create an organization that would be led by young people, college-age students, who would radicalize the civil rights movement. Because up to that point, you had flashpoints. Mm-hmm. It wasn't an everyday thing or an every week thing. It wasn't all filled with confrontation, sit-ins, and all of that. They were mostly legal actions taken. Mm-hmm. And it was usually something that was spearheaded by local NAACP groups to challenge segregation in the schools or in transportation or something like that. Mm-hmm. But her idea was to have a two-pronged SNCC organization, and the first prong would work in conjunction with the NAACP to challenge certain areas, but you would have that action
group on the other side.
On the other side, who would be the real radicals who would be in your face. They would organize the sit-ins. They would organize the protest marches. They would organize those things that would provide coverage, media coverage, and would be be a very visible element. And the reason why they thought young people, college age or even high school age children, is because adults have family responsibilities, they have jobs, mortgages, and so forth.
They can't really put themselves out there as much as a college student would be able to. Mm.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And but what's interesting is that with all of her work, all of these people who were involved in these organizations would never vote to have her in a leadership position. The most that she was able to serve as is a secretary. She was
That's as high as they would let her rise.
Right. She was an organizer, and it's interesting because she was such a private person that not until her autobiography came out did anyone even know she had been married at one point.
Wow.
She was that private a person. But she was an incredible force. She was seen as the grandmother of SNCC. Mm-hmm. And
for those who may not remember what SNCC stands for,
SNCC is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And of course, SNCC is the organization that planned the Freedom Summers both in 1963 and 1964 in Mississippi. And while the governor of Mississippi at that time thought that he was doing a good thing when they planned the 64 Freedom Summer by hiring about 1,000 more state police officers, and of course he made the announcement that if SNCC comes to Mississippi, blood would run in the streets. Mm-hmm. SNCC was there for two reasons. They wanted to help register people to vote, and they were starting what they call freedom schools, because a lot of the rural communities in Mississippi did not provide schools for black students. And so those were the two incendiary things that SNCC was doing. And for a governor to essentially say they were going to murder people was interesting. And of course, the organizers knew of SNCC. They knew that if black people went to Mississippi and they got killed, no one would pay any attention. And that's why they went out and they recruited all of these Midwestern white students to be part of the
because they
major
knew then
group.
If something happened, then they would get the attention.
And that was Ella Jo Baker who really pushed that particular idea through. So she was a behind-the-scenes worker, and that's kind of the other side of what you would see. You had some women who were very much visible and out in the front, but when they worked in some of these traditional organizations, and they were prevented from taking a leadership role, they would kind of go in another direction and still influence from behind and really call the shots or impact the way that organization would the initiatives that they would create.
I am always so fascinated when you come on, because you bring on so many different points about history that we really don't get to absorb, and I think that's so important. We've only got about 2 minutes left in our conversation today, and you're going to be sharing some more of this information tomorrow, yes, on February the 4th at the Newsom House. You want to talk about that event a little bit?
Yeah, I'm going to be talking about some of these issues, Black women, and the roles that they played not only in our community but also in the nation. I'll be at the Newsom House at 2 o'clock, and then on Sunday I'll be at the Pretlow Library at 2 o'clock again, talking probably slightly different, but talking about some of these same issues, continuing the conversation.
People should bring their children. We have to tell our story, and we have to continue to pass down our history if we're ever going to be able to move forward as a people.
Absolutely, and I'm convinced that children are really they absorb so much. All you have to do is talk around a child. If you talk around a child, they may not comprehend everything that you're saying, but they understand it. I used to have some students who would bring their children to class every day, and I am convinced to this day that those kids learn probably more than most of my students because they listened. And when you talk about history, there's this perception that, it's boring. No, history is one of the most fascinating topics, and I'd like to tell history by talking about real people who lived and using them as the example of whatever point I'm trying to make about this type or this group of people, and that's what gets people's attention. And I don't tell anecdotes that have no relevance or are fictional.
You tell truth about what has been going on. Cassandra, it is always a pleasure having you here on the show, and we will have you back because, as I said in the intro, on Another View, we talk about this all year long, and so I think that it's just something that enriches all of us. So thank you so much for being with us, and we'll be right back in just a moment.
And then a hero comes along with the strength to carry on, and you cast your fears aside, and you know you can survive. So when you feel like hope is gone, look inside you and be strong, and you'll finally see the truth.
And welcome back to the show. For 6 years running, WHRO and the Literacy Partnership have joined together to host a Scrabble tournament. Last year, there was only one African-American adult team to enter the Scrabble for Literacy tournament, and they won. Kim Daniels and Breton Key absolutely love the game, and they can't wait to compete again this year. Our Lisa Godley talked to the champions about last year's win, their strategies for the upcoming competition, and their all-out passion for the game.
Randomly grab a letter, and whoever has the closest letter to A goes first. So if you get an A, you're pretty much in there. If you get a Z, you're number 2.
When Kim Daniels and Breton Key started dating 4 years ago, they would only compete against each other. But 2 years ago, that changed when they decided to enter the Scrabble for Literacy tournament held at WHRO.
That's definitely right. To be honest, I sucked at Scrabble. I was really not that good of a player. She was a way better player than me, and she's not the type of person that would take a win graciously. So that motivated me to get better and better and play her more and more, and pretty soon it became an addiction. I can definitely say it's an addiction now. We play Scrabble quite frequently.
So I'm going to play X, I, S as my first word. X is worth 8, and the I and the S are worth 1, so that's 10. But because it's the first word on the board, I automatically get to double it, so I got 20 points for my first word.
Their first attempt at competing in a tournament, not so good.
There's time limits, and we didn't know that there were time limits. So the first year we didn't fare well at all because of the time limit. We got eliminated
really quick, but I think we learned more towards going to that next year. Was that instead of it really being Scrabble, it's really word chess. Because we had a strategy time was the biggest factor, being able to manage the clock. Once we kind of got a system rolling for that, and, we played with each other enough where, we were, pretty much know each other's style. So it came to be like a 1-2 punch.
So one of the things that helped in that we would encourage anybody who's wanting to play this year is to either go to the practices that they have or make sure that they show up, I think, an hour before the tournament starts to learn the official rules.
Not only were Kim and Breton the only African-American adult team to compete last year, but the smallest team, just the two of them.
Gluten. 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 14.
Okay, good play. Right now, even though we're not directly keeping the score, the game is really competitive.
But I'm winning.
Why do you think African Americans don't play Scrabble?
I don't think it's that we don't play, because a lot of our friends we play Scrabble with very competitively, but I think it's not promoted within the community. We were fortunate enough that one of my friends knew someone who worked for the literacy program and just happened to be telling her, we're trying to get more people to come out. And we said, oh, well, we love to play Scrabble, but I had never heard about it. So I wouldn't have known to look for, a Scrabble tournament in the area.
But Kim is glad she found out, because now she looks for tournaments to compete in. Breton says he's even looking around for a local league to join. The couple says they can't remember the final word they played in last year's literacy tournament, but
I do remember one thing, that the team that we played against, their first word was cryptic. Mm-hmm. And it was like, they were trying to make it like an intimidating play, because it was very, very smart. And out of everything they could have played, they had a really good start. I guess they kind of set the pace, so we knew that we had to bring our A game. So maybe that's why it's kind of a blur, because we would just focus on, like, hey, these people can really play, and let's see if we can outdo them a little bit.
And they did, using something Scrabble players call a bingo. By using all 7 of their letters, they racked up huge points. Thus the couple's competitive name, Team Bingo.
Go Team Bingo!
We wish them well. For Another View, I'm Lisa Godley.
And the 6th annual Scrabble for Literacy tournament will take place Saturday, February 24th, here at the WHRO studios on Hampton Boulevard. And if you're a little rusty, there are 2 more practice sessions being held February 5th and 19th from 3 to 6 p.m. at Barnes & Noble and MacArthur Center. As always, we've got some other community events for you. The Norfolk School Board is looking for your input in the selection of its next superintendent. There are 2 public hearings, both on Tuesday, February 7th, and both at 7 p.m. You can attend at either Booker T. Washington High School or Granby High School. Call 628-3994 for more information. The Urban League of Hampton Roads Young Professionals and Tidewater Community College present the 10th Annual Legacies Awards on Friday, February 10th at 6:30 at the TCC Roper Performing Arts Center. The event is free and family-friendly. To RSVP, visit ulhryp.com/legacies. And on Sunday, February the 12th, you're invited to attend the Addicts Theater Honors, celebrating Black women in Hampton Roads history and culture. The event is from 3 to 5 p.m., and for tickets, dial 664-6464. And that's our show for this week. Next Friday is the second Friday of the month, so that means it's time for the Another View Roundtable. For producer Lisa Godley, audio engineer Perry Smith, Megan Herrera on the phone, I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Have a marvelous weekend, and we'll see you next Friday for Another View.